Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we begin our 14th unit of study, having selected from a range of influential works of science fiction of the 20th century. No, I guess also 19th century, because I forgot that I included The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, which we are not going to be discussing because, well, you, the wonderful patrons of Stars and Swords, selected William Gibson's foundational 1984 cyberpunk heist thriller Neuromancer. In this session, we're going to look at Part 1, Chiba City Blues. But first, some background on Gibson, on cyberpunk, and on the wild, wild world that was the early 1980s. A quick warning right up front before we get to all of that. We are going to be dealing during this unit, and particularly this evening, with some issues surrounding transhumanism, which can bleed into questions of body horror. That is entirely subjective. Your mileage will, of course, vary. We're going to see definitely some problematic language directed toward women, directed towards sex workers, as well as some blunt and borderline problematic, certainly fetishized depictions of race. We're going to be dealing with trauma and mental health issues, and we are going to have this evening, for the first time in a long time, a brief discussion of a full-on sex scene. So this episode is a little more PG-13, maybe even a little more TV-14 than we normally get here on Stars and Swords. So listen with care if you are inclined to listen with kids close by. Hello to Hugh, who is joining me this evening, or as is usual for Hugh, the morning time. We're going to have a great discussion today. I'm really interested in this topic. It's been a fabulous opportunity to delve back into the works of Gibson, who, as I say, is just a foundational writer. Although, I will say, an interestingly foundational writer, right? a writer who creates a great deal of influence, really kind of shepherds the movement of cyberpunk without ever really wanting to architect it or even consciously trying to architect it. That falls to the hands of another fellow who we'll talk about in just a little bit. I want to begin, though, not with the cyber, but rather with the punk, because punk is a really interesting word, attested in English as early as 1680 in its main usage, right? Which is to mean that rotten wood that is unfit for any use but as tinder for the fire. The word punk doesn't evolve a more familiar meaning to us until the very late 19th century, where it becomes generalized out to mean anything that is worthless, that is bad, that is inferior in some way. In the early 20th century, it is first applied to people, specifically to punk kids. Punk kids, as a phrase, is brilliantly attested from 1904, referring, of course, to young men engaged in causing trouble and petty crime. The meaning shifts in a really interesting way through the 20th century. It ebbs and it flows. It becomes more or less critical, more or less insulting, more or less contemptuous under different circumstances. It becomes associated with and then falls out of usage to mean sex workers, or to blend with words used to describe particularly gay men through the course of the 20th century. What happens there is that it seems to blend with a distinct but homophonic word stemming from the 16th century, which is originally used to mean sex workers, but is much less common. It almost absorbs this entirely different meaning from this entirely different word, which just happens to sound the same. Adventures, you guys, in etymology. It isn't until 1971 that the word punk takes on its modern meaning. Independent and modern, certainly brutal, almost rebellious, sharp-edged, anti-establishment music and art aimed primarily at a non-commercial audience. Punk rock, as a phrase, is coined by music journalist Dave Marsh in 1971, describing rather brilliantly the Michigan-based garage band Question Mark and the Mysterians from the late 1960s. By the 70s, though, the meaning had shifted again, coming away from those indie garage bands to mean several distinct music scenes, right? The exact evolution of punk is far beyond the remit of this humble podcast. It would take a full year, I am sure, just to disentangle the various threads of punk culture and punk influence through that period. But throughout the 1970s, it is fair to say, the word punk becomes associated with these different underground musical movements, primarily for me, of course, the British punk movement, exemplified by bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash and the Buzzcocks, right? When I think of punk, that is still, despite all my time in these United States, what I think of. And around this time, in the late 1970s, science fiction writers begin picking up some of those same ideas, right? They are infused with some of that same sense of rebellion. They're interested in that same sense of noir dystopia. They're fusing that with this interest in transhumanism, with this rise of corporate greed and authoritarian control. We're preoccupied socially, certainly, but particularly within the minds and the imaginaries of science fiction writers with the clash of the new and the old, of crime and justice, of chrome and rust, of the real and the virtual, and of course the individual and the social. Comic books like 2000 AD, and in particular, of course, the character of Judge Dredd, give us this satirical perspective on a brutal future. We get movies like John Carpenter's 1981 film Escape from New York, a film that I really, really like, which sketches this cynical, broken, exhausted dystopia. All of which takes us to William Gibson, of whom I happen to have a slide. Gibson is born in Conway, South Carolina in 1948, and he spends most of his childhood in Virginia, moving around frequently because of his father's job. His father managed a major construction company in the area. When Gibson was 6, however, his father dies under unfortunate circumstances. Gibson develops a passion for science fiction as a way of escaping the conservative rural environment in which he and his mother find themselves. He reads the beat poets at an early age and is enthusiastic, surprisingly enthusiastic, when his mother suggests, based on his poor grades and academic performance in his local school district, that he might benefit from a boarding school experience. He is then enrolled in the Southern Arizona School for Boys in Tucson. And though he pushes back against the social structure and discipline of that environment, something that will become a feature in his later life, he later credits the school with forcing him to develop socially. Gibson's mother dies in 1966 when he is 18 years old. He leaves school without graduating. In some versions of the story, as he tells it, he is kicked out of school for smoking marijuana and then takes to the road, following in the footsteps of his beat poet influences. The following year, he travels to Canada to escape the Vietnam War draft, and he finds himself in Toronto during the Summer of Love, where he meets Deborah Jean Thompson, with whom he travels to Europe, stretching their small savings as far as they could. They eventually marry and move back to Vancouver in 1972, where Deborah begins teaching and Gibson enrolls in university primarily as a means of acquiring the then generous student aid offered by the Canadian government. Gibson graduates with a degree in English from the University of British Columbia in 1977. In 1980, he is convinced by punk musician and heavily influential figure in this scene and many others, John Shirley, to start taking his fiction writing seriously and to sell his stories. He's been writing pretty steadily since his teenage years, and he has already produced a handful of stories, including, iconically, Johnny Mnemonic, which introduces the sprawl. It introduces the character of Molly Millions, and it is itself canonical to the events of Neuromancer. And I am going to indulge myself by quoting here, not from the beginning of Neuromancer, but in fact from the opening of Johnny Mnemonic. I have limited myself to the briefest possible excerpt from the beginning of Johnny Mnemonic, but it is so good, I could not resist it. Quote, "I put the shotgun in an Adidas bag and padded it out with 4 pairs of tennis socks. Not my style at all, but that was what I was aiming for. If they think you're crude, go technical. If they think you're technical, go crude. I'm a very technical boy." It's just perfect. It is punchy. It is precise. It is loaded with character right from the jump. And it is perfectly styled. And this really gives us an insight here into what we can get from Gibson, because he is a fantastic world builder. He is, though I think he would broadly reject the title, something of a visionary, right? He has a sense of how society can move, if not entirely how society will move. But the thing that differentiates Gibson from his peers and from many other writers who followed in his footsteps and many other writers who deliberately tried to ape his style, what distinguishes Gibson is his stylistic skill. It is his ability to just put words on a page and summon forth enormous quantities of character here, the character of Johnny, and a really provocative, jagged, sharp-edged kind of style that forces you to confront the uncomfortable truths of the lives of these characters. We get that here, right? This perfectly kind of paralleled sequence of thoughts it's not my style at all, but that's what I was aiming for. If they think you're crude, go technical. If they think you're technical, go crude. I'm a very technical boy. And further through that paragraph, of course, he explores then what that means. So he is going as crude as he can. What is the alternative to his technical literacy, to his technical skill? Well, it's the crudity of a shotgun. But he has to leverage all of his technical skill in order to specifically manufacture ammunition for said shotgun. It is this Ouroboros of being technical and crude that, you know, lies in the balance. The line that one must walk lies in the balance. Of course, very little of this makes it into the material that we're going to cover in our bonus episode for this unit, which is, of course, the 1995 movie of Johnny Mnemonic, starring Keanu Reeves. A pretty free bit of adaptation, I think, but still a very fun piece of work. In the autumn of 81, then, Gibson goes to a sci-fi convention in Denver, Colorado, where in front of an audience of 4 people, including author Bruce Sterling, he reads his short story Burning Chrome, the story which invents the word cyberspace. Well, almost invents the word cyberspace. It turns out that another writer, Bruce Bethke, had also come up with the word that same year, I believe, though his story wouldn't be published until much later. So Gibson gets both first mover advantage there and much of the credit for inventing cyberspace. It also gives us the sprawl, this conurbation which extends down the east coast of the United States all the way from Boston down to Atlanta. More on that in next week's reading. It is it is an enormously influential work, and it leads to Gibson being contracted to write an entire novel set in that same world. He is daunted, but does so, writing in a near panic, a process which is complicated by the release, when Gibson is a third of the way into his draft of Neuromancer, of a little movie called Blade Runner. This is a still here, probably the most iconic still, I would say, from Ridley Scott's dystopian science fiction epic, Blade Runner, a movie which has been revised more times than Gibson revises Neuromancer, which is impressive because he believes that the audience of the film would believe that he had copied much of the look and feel of the novel from the admittedly fairly similar movie. He rewrites the latter half of Neuromancer obsessively. He will later say that he wrote 12 full drafts, which at the time, considering the technical impediment to writing that many words, is phenomenal. He finally submits the manuscript and the book is published as planned, and it meets with a kind of modest commercial success right out of the gate, but the sci-fi industry takes immediate note. Neuromancer wins the Nebula and the Hugo for Best Novel, back when the Hugos were worth something, and it won the Philip K. Dick Award for the Best Paperback Original. It sold over 6.5 million copies and immediately secures Gibson's place as one of the most important voices in modern SF. He goes on to write 2 more books in the Neuromancer series, later renamed the Sprawl Trilogy. In 1990, he writes a novel called The Difference Engine with the aforementioned Bruce Sterling, which basically invents steampunk as a subgenre. He's responsible for that one too. Cyberspace becomes one of the operative terms for the internet in the early days of the World Wide Web, and Gibson is cited, of course, as a major inspiration for the Matrix movies. He writes 2 episodes of The X-Files and a very early draft of the 3rd Alien movie, which is really interesting. He inspires things like Lonely Girl 15 and the first real wave of transmedia storytelling on the internet. He's a gigantic influence on the works of Christopher Nolan, see Inception and Tenet, if nothing else. And at the age of 77, he is still a vibrant presence on the internet and an excellent follow on Blue Sky. I do want to asterisk this just a little by noting, well, noting 2 things that muddy our otherwise pitch-perfect sense of this unfolding history, right? The first is that the rebellion of the cyberpunk authors against the golden age of science fiction really dismisses like fully half of the science fiction new wave, which had replaced the golden age 20 years previously, right? The new wave is much more complicated, and a lot of what, well, in the same way as a lot of what the punks were rebelling against across the board, right, in every form of art, was actually the domination of their space, not by the voices of the generation immediately above them, but of the voices of the generation 2 above them, right, in terms of who is controlling the space in which they find themselves. So we do discount New Wave a little bit, and far more seriously, far more importantly, if we take this history of the development of science fiction, we also really dismissed the work of many important, primarily female science fiction authors in the 1970s as we're moving into this second wave of feminist science fiction. Someday soon we're going to talk about Le Guin, or we'll talk about Joanna Russ, or we'll talk about someone who is fully representative of the movement. But it is important to note here that this clean history of golden age science fiction being usurped by this more dystopian, more technically edged vision of the future isn't completely true, although it is the story that is set out for us. And I mention all of this because, less so than most subgenre classifications, cyberpunk doesn't really mean anything, right? It's mostly a marketing term that is codified from the works of disparate authors, including William Gibson, by the aforementioned Bruce Sterling. He is the one that takes the work of these young artists and brands it such that it can be popularized. This modern, punchy, but still kind of noir-inflected, still pulp-inflected kind of storytelling. Gibson himself was conflicted about the use of the label, partly because it felt that he felt that it denigrated his own work, but he also observed that it helped his fellow writers, that they were able to follow along in his footsteps. They were able to write his tailcoats just a little bit, and some deserving writers were getting more attention because of this branding initiative orchestrated by Bruce Sterling. In any case, that doesn't mean that what we observe about cyberpunk isn't accurate. It's just that as a term, it is a little more proactively descriptive than we otherwise might imagine. So Sterling's invention, this marketing capital, this brand of cyberpunk, certainly helps all of these books find an audience. We get Gibson and Jeter and the aforementioned John Shirley, who does a wonderful job too, Sterling himself, Pat Cadigan. All of this extends out from the cyberpunk revolution of the 80s into the 90s, where it kind of it meets the mainstream and is blurred with it in some really interesting ways. This leads us directly to writers like Neil Stephenson. It leads us directly to properties like Shadowrun. It leads us to The Running Man and Strange Days and the Deus Ex video games. And of course, I haven't even touched here on the anime and manga influence, which is so important too, both before and after Akira and Ghost in the Shell and many, many other things besides. All of which is to say that the footprint of Neuromancer is, in some senses, almost incalculable. There's almost not an area of science fiction over the last 35 years that has not in some ways been significantly altered by the presence of William Gibson in this space. He has done a colossal amount to set the stage for our interactions with the digital space, which he had no way of knowing, really, in 1982, how prevalent, how ubiquitous, how demanding, how challenging, how destructive, and how filled with opportunity these digital spaces would be. And a lot of our thinking about it, and not just narratively thinking, but scientifically thinking, sociologically thinking, psychologically thinking, a lot of the ways in which we interact with digital spaces were anticipated and codified by Gibson, even back in 1982, all of which takes us, I have to say, to the opening of the book. And I'm very glad that we made it before, I'd spent a full half hour on this. I'm a little cautious now about how long this entire session is going to run. Hugh's commenting here in the chat that he enjoyed Gibson's introduction to the book, commenting on the progress of technology from when the book was written, 1984, and the writing of the introduction in 2004. And what's so fascinating is that because Gibson is still active, because he's still giving interviews, we're getting to see the further evolution of that thought. And obviously, I said back when we were discussing The Haunting of Hill House, our previous unit here on Stars and Swords, that the opening of Neuromancer is, if not as famous, if not as flawless as the opening of The Haunting of Hill House, it is still a phenomenal accomplishment. And it depends in large part upon something which will not be emotionally or experientially transparent to the reader. This is something that Gibson observes in his prefatory material, that as technology has moved on, not just the substance of the story, but the metaphorical weight of the story has changed, has shifted, has become altered over time. As Hugh says, when the book was written, authors were experimenting with a new openness to sex and violence that seemed to be permissible in those times. Certainly the editors and publishers had opened the gates to allow it to trickle through. I think that this is very true, Hugh, though part of the strength of that, part of the robustness of what cyberpunk delivers, particularly what Neuromancer delivers, particularly here in its opening part in these first two chapters, is a real sense of the pulp noir, right? We're really just doing a detective story with a lot of the proper nouns changed, right? The emotional arc that we get here through the opening parts of the story, I think, are very familiar, which really allows Gibson to shortcut a lot of the world building. He doesn't have to tell us a lot about these emotional states or the relationships between men and women or the relationships between, Case and his bartender. We can skip over a lot of that because all of it is familiar. All of it is deeply embedded in our shared narrative sense. So instead, he gets to put his focus where it needs to be, which is building out the specifics of this world. Let's get into our opening slide here, our opening excerpt, and begin Neuromancer. The sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a dead channel. It's not like I'm using, Case heard someone say as he shouldered his way through the crowd around the door of the chat. It's like my body has developed this massive drug deficiency. It was a sprawl voice and a sprawl joke. The Chetsuba was a bar for professional expatriates. You could drink there for a week and never hear 2 words in Japanese. Rats was tending bar, his prosthetic arm jerking monotonously as he filled a tray of glasses with draft Kirin. He saw Case and smiled, his teeth a webwork of East European steel and brown decay. Case found a place at the bar between the unlikely tan on one of Lonnie Zone's whores and the crisp naval uniform of a tall African whose cheekbones were ridged with precise rows of tribal scars. Wage was in here earlier with 2 Joe boys, Rat said, shoving a draft across the bar with his good hand. Maybe some business with you, Case. Case shrugged. The girl to his right giggled and nudged him. The bartender's smile widened. His ugliness was the stuff of legend. In an age of affordable beauty, there was something heraldic about his lack of it. The antique arm whined as he reached for another mug. It was a Russian military prosthesis, a 7-function force feedback manipulator cased in grubby pink plastic. You are too much the artiste, Air Case. Rat grunted. The sound served him as laughter. He scratched the overhang of white-shirted belly with the pink claw. You are the artiste of the slightly funny deal. Sure, Case said and sipped his beer. Somebody's got to be funny around here. Sure the fuck isn't you. So, in much the same way as the opening of The Haunting of Hill House will absolutely tell you whether or not you are interested in reading The Haunting of Hill House, I will say again that the opening of Neuromancer will tell you pretty damn quick whether or not you are interested in reading the rest of Neuromancer. I, for the record, very much am. I read this book, probably a little earlier than I should, probably in my fairly early teenage years. It feels like the kind of book that I would have picked up from the fairly well-provisioned library adjacent to my school when I was, 11 or 12 possibly. So I almost certainly read it then. I'm not sure that I loved it as much as I should have done at that point, or maybe I loved it exactly as much as I should have done at that point. Much later in my teenage years, I returned to it and really secured my love of Gibson's work. I read the Sprawl trilogy. I then, I think, jumped ahead to Pattern Recognition, which is another real candidate for a fantastic book we could cover here. As Gibson's career progresses, he lets the cyberpunk detail kind of fall out of his stories. He adopts this more naturalistic tone while maintaining a strict hold on many of the themes that he's discussing as we move forward here. But it's almost as though that as the world catches up with him, he has to invent less and less. He can anchor these same conversations, these same preoccupations in a world that is more naturalistic because the world around him has changed. Here, though, we are getting a lot of world building, and it hits hard right from the jump. So here we are in Chiba, Japan, across the bay from Tokyo, 25 miles, I think, east of Tokyo. We can see Tokyo across the bay at several points in this opening reading, so we know that that's kind of the relationship here. We're in this outland, this exiled space, and though we're presented here with a world drenched in globalism, right? We get all of this detail immediately. We don't know yet what the sprawl is. We don't know what its relationship is to Chetsuba, to Chiba, Japan, right? But we do know that this is a place for expats. Expats live here, and we're getting a strong sense of that globalism. We get the naval uniform of the tall African, right? We get all of the, obviously, Ratz's strange Germanic Russian kind of situation going on. We're presented with a global society, but we're also anchored in the most peculiar of cyberpunk fascinations, this weird preoccupation with East Asia, particularly with Japan, which on one hand, of course, represents the acknowledgement of the economic and technological recovery of Japan following the Second World War, right? There is a real boom in technological innovation and in economic growth in Japan around this time. This is the point at which, in real life, in the early 1980s, America is starting to look very nervously across the Pacific at these emergent economies. This is a powerful part of the political landscape of the early 80s. But on the other hand, though Gibson is on the one hand acknowledging that, on the other hand, there is something here that sometimes teeters perilously close to exoticization or an othering that is happening here, a strange and a retrograde Orientalism. And I want to put a pin in this as we move forward, because one of the things that I really want to do is interrogate Gibson's relationship with race. And ordinarily, I would hold off on this a little bit. I would give us a little space to observe the text and then see what we think of it. But I think that we have enough here already that we can begin to infer both Gibson's position and the obvious and immediate problems that that position represents. I'm going to skip over, a few other examples that we get in this opening sequence to kind of present my conclusion and then to encourage us all to break that conclusion as we move forward. I want to present this as a thought experiment that we can then test as we go forward. In fact, let me read the next part of this opening. We're going to do 3 successive slides here right on the opening. That's far more than we're normally going to read for our journey through this book, but this intro is so punchy. Let's read the second half of this, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about Gibson's specific relationship with race and ideas of race. The whore's giggle went up an octave. Isn't you either, sister? So you vanish, okay, Zone? He's a close personal friend of mine. She looked Case in the eye and made the softest possible spitting sound, her lips barely moving. But she laughed. Jesus, Case said. What kind of creep joint you running here? Man can't have a drink. Ha, Red said, swabbing the scarred wood with a rag. Zone shows a percentage. You let work here for entertainment value. As Case was picking up his beer, one of those strange instants of silence descended, as though 100 unrelated conversations had simultaneously arrived at the same pause. Then the whore's giggle rang out, tinged with a certain hysteria. Rats grunted. An angel passed. The Chinese, bellowed a drunken Australian. Chinese bloody invented nerve splicing. Give me the mainland for a nerve job any day. Fix you right, mate. Now that, Case said to his glass, all his bitterness suddenly rising in him like bile, that is so much bullshit. Okay, we're going to come back to race in just 1 second. We put a pin in race, but I do want to observe this moment of suspension. Because even here, even as we are on the ground in the city, even as we are being introduced to these characters who are just grinding out their experience, right? Who are facing adversity in every way, who are even among themselves kind of edged and dangerous and uncompromising, because you have to be in order to survive in these moments, right? Because we're focused on individuality, because we're focused in this strange corporate future in which the alternative to corporate obedience and authoritarian control, as we will see, is a kind of fierce, solitary independence, right? That's going to be what we see of Case throughout tonight's reading in particular. Because we're in this position, this moment of unity, this moment of an angel passing, as Rats says here, really strikes me. It really forces me to confront the idea that even in this moment, right? Hugh's observing here, the first chapter is total grittiness. It is so gritty, right? But even then, we get this moment of transcendence. We get this moment of something we're almost dared to think it by Rats' intercession here, of something supernatural interceding. And much, much later in the book, we are going to be able to think, well, there is kind of a something at work here. There is a force at work in Case's life right now, even though he doesn't yet know it. I really love how that moment is presented and how we crash back out of it, right? With the whore's giggle, right? A word that I don't like using, but I'm not going to spend, hours turning backflips here. As I say, the attitude of this book towards sex workers, the attitude of the early 1980s towards sex workers, is something that we can very comfortably just write off and leave that we had wish that we had left, in fact, in the dumpster of history here, right? But what we get is the sharp transition back out of it, right? Not just a drunken Australian, an absolute stereotype, an absolute cliche, but a drunken Australian complaining about the Chinese, or I guess, celebrating the Chinese, I suppose, and their accomplishments, which Case, who knows more and who is better off, does not agree with. Here is my thesis, and I want to, as I say, offer this for interrogation as we move forward. There are unambiguously some problematic elements around the depiction of race in Neuromancer, but I don't think that these stem from any kind of underlying racist suppositions on the part of William Gibson, right? This isn't a Tolkien situation. We're not having to whistle past some race theory that is inculcated into you during your school years. This, I think, is something very different. I think that what Gibson is doing here is bravely trying to imagine and depict on the page in front of us a truly post-racial future. I think that he is trying to give us a sense that the world really has, in some ways, moved on, at least in terms of the depiction of race, right? At least in terms of the presentation of desirability and physical, the physical manifestations of race. Obviously, we're still leaning very hard on the idea that there is culture, that culture is real and operative and almost definitive, right? Which is problematic in its own way, but also, I think, not accidental. I think that these are things that Gibson is doing very, very deliberately. So I want to move through this book and kind of test this idea as we go, that what we're getting from Gibson in terms of his depiction of race is a world that is, in terms of the strict appearance and delineation of racial identity, over it, that we have moved on, that we are past it now, but that what we see instead is the manifestation of deeper grudges and deeper presumptions, deeper stereotypes, deeper ideas about character and identity. We'll keep an eye on that as we go. What we have to look at right now, though, is the conclusion to this opening and this incredibly powerful perspective shift that we are just about to get, because it turns out that Case isn't just, grumpy about this drunken Australian, and he certainly doesn't have a grudge per se against the Chinese. He has a much more direct and personal connection to this question of nerve splicing. Let's take a look at our next slide. The Japanese had already forgotten more neurosurgery than the Chinese had ever known. The black clinics of Chiba were the cutting edge, whole bodies of techniques supplanted monthly, and still they couldn't repair the damage he'd suffered in the Memphis hotel. A year here, and he still dreamed of cyberspace, hope fading nightly. All the speed he took, all the turns he'd taken and the corners he'd cut in Night City, and still he'd see the Matrix in his sleep, bright lattices of logic unfolding across the colorless void. The sprawl was a long, strange way home over the Pacific now, and he was no console man, no cyberspace cowboy, just another hustler trying to make it through. But the dreams came on in the Japanese night like live wire voodoo, and he'd cry for it, cry in his sleep, and wake alone in the dark, curled in his capsule in some coffin hotel, his hands clawed into the bed slab, temper foam bunched between his fingers, trying to reach the console that wasn't there. If we know anything about cyberspace coming into this book, which, as I say, it's almost impossible not to know at least a few things about cyberspace coming into this book. If we know anything at all, though, we are familiar, I think, with this idea of the mind-body duality, right? We get the mind-body problem here really realized for us in a way that is unparalleled, I think, in terms of its engagement and its complexity. We're accustomed to thinking of these characters as existing in body and in mind, that these things are separate. You have a being, and you have, if you are Case, meat. You have the prison of your body. But one of the things that Gibson does, even here, in the first moment with which we are introduced to this concept, right, the first moment in which this concept becomes real to us on the page, Gibson is already playing with it. He's already challenging our preconceptions. He's challenging our suppositions. He's challenging what we take to be true of this world, because the first thing that we get is Case's experience of the unbodied experience of jacking into the Matrix, of exploring cyberspace, of being taken into this digital realm, right? That experience that has been taken from him is being forcibly reasserted on his body by the unbodied part of him that dreams. Both sides, or two of the many sides of Case's unbodied self, of his mind, if you like, are leveraging their own experience or their own memory or their own fantasy, their own desire against Case's body. It isn't just the case that he can't reach the thing that he wants. It is so much worse than that, because things within him, bodied and unbodied, remember. This is when Case leaves the bar and we get the backstory, which I suppose is something that I should offer as a band-aid for any of you who are having trouble making it through this book. This is a very common rhetorical device that Gibson will use throughout the book, throughout all of his books, really. He will deliver the emotional punch of a scene or an experience in a way that is opaque. He will not give you all the information. He will not tell you everything that is going on. He will not explain himself fully in the moment. Instead, what you'll get is this kind of sense impression experience, right? We get the account of Case having this moment, but the dreams came on in the Japanese night like live wire voodoo, and he'd cry for it, cry in his sleep. We don't really have a sense of what is going on. We don't understand the movement of the plot. And then in the very next scene, sometimes a couple scenes later, Gibson will circle back and explain it. He will circle back and give us the accounting of what we need to know exactly. Here, for example, we learn that Case is 24 now, 2 years out from the heights of his success as a console cowboy, a thief who steals for thieves, who goes anywhere in the virtual world for the right price. He steals from his employers and as a consequence is hit with this Russian mycotoxin, which burns out his ability to interface with cyberspace. We get this quote here: Case fell into the prison of his own flesh. So he goes to Chiba. He goes to the place in the world that he, as a knowledgeable, experienced person in this field, knows is the best place to go, and they can't help him. Let's take a look at our next slide. Night City was like a deranged experiment in social Darwinism designed by a bored researcher who kept one thumb permanently on the fast forward button. Stop hustling and you sank without a trace, but move a little too swiftly and you'd break the fragile surface tension of the black market. Either way, you were gone, with nothing left of you but some vague memory in the mind of a fixture like rats, though heart or lungs or kidneys might survive in the service of some stranger with new yen for the clinic tanks. Biz here was a constant subliminal hum, and death the accepted punishment for laziness, carelessness, lack of grace, the failure to heed the demands of an intricate protocol. Alone at a table in the jar de thé, with the octagon coming on, pinheads of sweat starting from his palms, suddenly aware of each tingling hair on his arms and chest, Case knew that at some point he'd started to play a game with himself, a very ancient one that has no name, a final solitaire. He no longer carried a weapon, no longer took the basic precautions. He ran the fastest, loosest deals on the street, and he had a reputation for being able to get whatever you wanted. A part of him knew that the arc of his self-destruction was glaringly obvious to his customers, who grew steadily fewer, but that same part of him basked in the knowledge that it was only a matter of time. And that was the part of him, smug in its expectation of death, that most hated the thought of Linda Lee. So, for all that Gibson can be oblique, sometimes we get the unvarnished truth in its brutality, in its mechanism, in its concrete certainty. This is how the world works. Case is correct. And exactly how we interpret Case, well, that's maybe going to be something that we're going to have to leave until halfway through the book, honestly, and maybe even the very end of the book to really wrestle with, because Case, I know, is an acquired taste for some. So we have, I guess, on the first side of this, we should acknowledge the other major theme here, right? The intersection of the body, not with the mind, but with technology. The purpose of the body, for Case, was to interface with the machine. Then the machine, in the most aggregate, general, metaphorical sense, right? He connects with the machine, and that is where he lives. Then the machine, a different machine, but still the technology, right? The machine burns out his ability to do so, and then, to add insult to injury, the machine is insufficient to restore it. The idea of technology is all at once unified and amorphous and omnipotent, but also in its specific application to the world, sorely lacking, whether that is in the provision of, comfort and clean water and clean food and the air above. I cannot believe, in fact, I'm just now realizing that we skipped over the television tuned to the dead channel. Having called it out as something that would leave modern readers behind, I, in fact, left it behind because, okay, to pause here, to rewind, what Gibson means is not black, which is what you get nowadays. If you turn on your TV and there's nothing coming through it, you get a black screen, right? It might not be true black. You might have like a backlit glow there, but it will be basically a black screen right there in front of you. It will be a black mirror, to coin a phrase. But the screen that Gibson is thinking of in that opening description of the city is not simply black. It's not just night. It is much worse than that. It is the kind of phosphorescent silver glow that you would get from an old CRT television, right? As you turn it off and the glow fades and goes through this kind of flat slate gray, this metallic gray sheen. That is the color that Gibson is envisioning as he points us toward the sky above the city, that it is an artificial color. We get a couple of other references through this first chapter that the air above Chiba City is toxic, that the air is bad news, that how is it he describes it? That it's got some bite? Is that the line that we get? There's so much specific detail in this chapter that I couldn't possibly pull it all out, but it's lovely nonetheless. So here, as I say, we establish this idea that we have the duality between the body and the mind, but we also have this duality between the body and technology. The body being positioned here as a conduit for the mind to connect in an unfiltered, true, powerful way with the technology, with cyberspace itself. We're then introduced to, as I showed right at the end of that last slide, we get this this sketched memory of Linda Lee, who is going to appear, 3 times in the course of this chapter and will then vanish out of the story because she will meet with an unfortunate end. A classic noir figure. We don't need to know anything about Linda Lee in order to understand her relationship with Case and understand the actions that she takes later in the chapter. There will be a twist on that much, much later. But for now, she works just as the girl who fell into it, right? She is the innocent. She is the virgin figure, to borrow from noir stereotypes and noir cliches, who is touched by the darkness and corrupted by it. Usually we position the noir hero as the defender of that girl, of the ingenue, of the virgin character, right? The noir hero is usually positioned between the femme fatale who has succumbed to the darkness and the virgin who must not, right? You can think of a Tess Trueheart kind of figure here, right? But Linda has been corrupted already. She's been taken. We get this account of her, of Case meeting her in the video arcade, and she looks at him both startled and vulnerable. And then he watches her succumb to her addiction. Well, in fact, let's just skip ahead because the next slide is our introduction to Linda herself. Yes, let me call this up here. Hey, Case, good buddy. He looked up, met gray eyes ringed with paint stick. She was wearing faded French orbital fatigues and new white sneakers. I've been looking for you, man. She took a seat opposite him, her elbows on the table. The sleeves of the blue jumpsuit had been ripped off at the shoulders. He automatically checked her arms for signs of derms or the needle. Want a cigarette? She dug a crumpled pack of Yehuan filters from her ankle pocket and offered him one. He took it, let her light it with a red plastic tube. You sleeping okay, Case? You look tired. Her accent put her south along the sprawl toward Atlanta. The skin below her eyes was pale and unhealthy looking, but the flesh was still smooth and firm. She was 20. New lines of pain were starting to etch themselves permanently at the corners of her mouth. Her dark hair was drawn back, held by a band of printed silk. The pattern might have represented microcircuits or a city map. Not if I remember to take my pills, he said, as a tangible wave of longing hit him, lust and loneliness riding in on the wavelength of amphetamine. He remembered the smell of her skin in the overheated darkness of a coffin near the port, her fingers locked across the small of his back. All the meat, he thought, and all it wants. So again, pulling out that division here between what Case sees as his true self, this disembodied self, and the reality of his experience, the meat of his body and his carnal desire. Even here, we get to see Gibson, playing some really deft games, playing a little 3-card Monty here with us in terms of our understanding of what is and is not real. The pattern of Linda's scarf might have represented microcircuits or a city map, right? Conflating, comparing, contrasting to a certain extent the super tower structure of the matrix of cyberspace and the reality of Night City here in Japan. The positioning of Linda is fascinating. I want to call out, okay, quickly plot. We learn that Case owes many people money, including this guy, Wage, who is, Linda tells him, looking to make an example of him. Nonetheless, Case gives Linda a little money and then leaves, and we get this fantastic beat right at the end of the passage. I didn't pull this out on the slide, but I wanted to call it out nonetheless. We get this beat here, quote, "I'll see you, Linda," he said, getting up. "Sure." A millimeter of white showed beneath each of her pupils. "Sanpaku. You want your back, man." End quote. And what's brilliant here is that Sanpaku, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Japanese is not one of my strong points, I'm afraid, which is a real hindrance for this book, but Sanpaku is a Japanese term meaning 3 whites. That is, you can see the white of the eye, not just to the left and right of the iris, but also above or below. In this particular case, it is below, which is associated with qualities of vulnerability and sensitivity. Also, it implies a tragic fate or tragic destiny. The archetypes of this kind of appearance are Princess Diana and Marilyn Monroe. So, we're invoking some pretty heavy cliches here, heavy traditional roles here. And this echoes, of course, with that look of innocence on Linda's face when he first meets her, that look of vulnerability. We even get that beat right after their first meeting that he takes her hand like a child. There is clearly something very protective about Case and Linda's relationship here. But what's so great here is that as she is displaying this, Linda doesn't normally exhibit this yin sanpaku, right? In this instance, Case is causing it. because he stands so her eyes follow him upward, so the white at the bottom of the eye is revealed. He is the direct cause of this symbol of ominous fate, right? And the interaction, the medium of interaction between them at that moment is the physical. It is the meat. I love this exchange, and obviously we'll circle back to Linda in just a moment. Case goes out into Night City and wonders about the mysterious Wage and exactly how much danger he is, and here the plot shifts gears, and I know that if you've stuck with this book through the grittiness, you might still drop out here because of the circles that Case is running through Chiba City here, right? We're just going to revisit the same locations like twice over. It's going to be frantic. We're going to introduce a stack of characters, and we're not really going to... We're going to sketch them, and those sketches are very deft, but we're not going to commit to them. We're not going to anchor the reader in the experience of the moment. Or rather, we are going to anchor the reader in only the experience of the moment. We're not getting the backstory here. We're just getting this, as I say, sense impression of Case losing it, right? Fueled on amphetamines and black coffee, he is just now losing his mind. So he goes to visit with Julius Dean, a man of advanced age and significant wealth and an admirable collection of affectations and eccentricities, who doesn't really help him at all, right? He's not much help to Case at this point. After leaving Dean, Case realizes he's being followed. He manages to elude pursuit for long enough to order a gun, and then goes to a different place to buy a Cobra, a kind of telescoping baton, which I'm honestly not sure I have ever been able to really accurately or effectively picture the Cobra. I am not quite sure in my imagination what that thing looks like, but I'm sure there are pictures out there. I just haven't gone looking for them, honestly. Case then goes back to the chat and he talks with Zone, the pimp who was mentioned earlier, who isn't any help. Then he goes back out on the street. He runs from his pursuers into the arcade where he first met Linda. So we're less than a chapter in and the story is already folding in on itself. It's established 4, 5, 6 core locations, and we're cycling through them in a way that gives us a sense of Case running around like a rat in a maze. The walls are literally closing in. The pace is increasing. The tempo is building. We get this beat where Case sets up the trap in the arcade, but his courage fails him and he jumps from a window out onto the street, returning to Shin to get his gun, then to the cheap hotel, right? We get this moment of peace, this ebbing of the pressure, the ebbing of the tension in this moment. He goes to cheap hotel to check his stash and to try and close some deals, try and get enough money to pay off Wage so that he will no longer be hunted. He's just trying to make it through the night. The detail that he's been holding on to, 3 megabytes of RAM for a buyer, is just fantastic. I love, there are so few things that age this poorly, honestly, in this book, but wow, that's one of them. And there's no way that anyone could have known at the time that 3 megabytes would have been outdated within, a span of very few years. The new iPhone, the brand new iPhone, has, I think, 12 gigabytes of RAM, which would be 4,000 times as much as Case is holding right now. This, as I say, in fairness, it's taken from a book written in the era of the Apple II and the Commodore 64, both of which are limited to 64 kilobytes of RAM. This, I suppose, is what, just a couple of years after Bill Gates is reported to have said, though apparently he never said this, but, if you Google Bill Gates quotes, I'm pretty sure this will be the top of the list no matter where you go online. Bill Gates reportedly said that 640 kilobytes of RAM would be enough for anyone, period, which is just, of course, a laughably small amount. That's what, less than half of a floppy disk. That's nothing. So I guess Case is what, holding enough RAM for 50 early 80s desktop PCs, which is, it's pretty impressive. It's not nothing. Anyway, we established this space in the cheap hotel, in his coffin there, his stash. Then we eventually wind up back at the chat where Wage and his goons show up. We get this great standoff with Rats. Absolutely. You can take the technical specifics out of it. Absolutely a scene from a really nasty pulp detective novel of the 30s. Then we finally get our confrontation with Wage, which turns out to be not a confrontation with Wage. If I can persuade this slide to load. There it is. Case felt the weight of the night come down on him like a bag of wet sand settling behind his eyes. He took the flask out of his pocket and handed it to Wage. All I got. Pituitaries. Give you 500 if you move it fast. Had the rest of my roll on some RAM, but that's gone by now. You okay, Case? The flask had already vanished behind a gunmetal lapel. I mean, fine, this'll square us, but you look bad. Like hammered shit. You better get somewhere and sleep. Yeah. He stood up and felt the chat sway around him. I had this 50, but I gave it to somebody. He giggled. He picked up the 22's magazine and the one loose cartridge and dropped them into one pocket, then put the pistol in the other. I gotta see Shin, get my deposit back. Go home, said Rats, shifting on the creaking chair with something like embarrassment. Artiste, go home. He felt them watching as he crossed the room and shouldered his way past the plastic doors. Case has been set up. And the brilliance of this is that Case knows, and this is oftentimes a feature of the modern hero. Oh, I should probably, I'm tempted to do a quick sketch of the modern hero, but perhaps we can wait. Perhaps we can talk about modern heroes right at the beginning of next week's show. I have my own kind of custom taxonomy of heroism through the ages. One of the things that defines the modern hero is self-awareness. The modern hero knows, unlike other previous kinds of hero, what kind of story he is in. He has no illusions about the nature of the world. The modern hero is rarely surprised by the underlying nature of things, right? He can be shocked, surprised, disappointed in the moment, but really it only ever confirms what he knew to be true about the status quo. And that's kind of operative here too. Case understands how this kind of story goes. He runs into his sometimes girlfriend who says, hey, you better look out, there's a guy looking for you. And Case, of course, knows there's a guy looking for him because he runs the fastest, loosest deals on the strip. Like, he is the guy that is out there. He is the one who is hanging all the way out to dry, this kind of quasi-repressed. I mean, he himself seems to be conscious of it, right? But it is not an active kind of attempt at self-harm, but it is a kind of suicidal ideation, right? It is opening the doors to fate and encouraging it to come through. That's what we're seeing from Case here. But the story isn't quite as simple, even here, as Case expects it to be, because Case returns to his stash. He figures out that the way that Linda used his money was to bribe the kid on the door and steal his hibachi, but even here, the story isn't moving quite as we expect it to. Because waiting for him is the second of our major characters in Neuromancer, and the character that is inherited here from the short story Johnny Mnemonic. As I say, Johnny Mnemonic is canon. Molly is going to hint toward the events of Johnny Mnemonic later in the story. But we have to introduce Molly Millions. So what do you want, lady? He sagged back against the hatch. You. One live body, brain still somewhat intact. Molly. Case. My name's Molly. I'm collecting you for the man I work for. Just wants to talk is all. Nobody wants to hurt you. That's good. Except I do hurt people sometimes, Case. I guess it's just the way I'm wired. She wore tight black glove leather jeans and a bulky black jacket cut from some matte fabric that seemed to absorb light. If I put this dart gun away, will you be easy, Case? You look like you like to take You look like you like to take stupid chances. Hey, I'm very easy. I'm a pushover, no problem. That's fine, man. The Fletcher vanished into the black jacket. Because you try to fuck around with me, you'll be taking one of the stupidest chances of your whole life. She held out her hands, palms up, the white fingers slightly spread, and with a barely audible click, 10 double-edged 4-centimeter scalpel blades slid from their housings beneath the burgundy nails. She smiled. The blades slowly withdrew. This, then, is our Razor Girl Molly Millions fan favorite. Like, almost undeniably. I think if you asked basically anyone who they like best in all of Neuromancer, Molly Millions is going to come pretty close to the top of the list. And there's a complex thing here that I don't really know how to address. This is also, I suppose, in the spirit of opening a conversation rather than offering a definitive perspective. Because partly I'm thinking here about the aesthetic landscape of cyberpunk itself, right? And partly I'm thinking about the aesthetic landscape of the early 1980s, but mostly I am thinking about the problem, the paradox of coolness. Because within a fairly limited margin of error, I think we know it when we see it, and most of us will agree. Most of us will be able to look at someone or something and you know, with like 10 or 15% variation, say that is cool or that is not cool. But because coolness is about agency and uniquity and about desirability, right? Not usually as an object, but as an icon, not something that you know, in terms of a cool person, not necessarily someone that you want to possess, but someone that you want to be, someone you want to emulate. Because coolness is both kind of fundamental and immediate and also kind of ephemeral and impossible to define, there is, it seems to me, a real thin line between being cool and being juvenile. Like, Batman is cool, But Batman can also be extremely silly. And the line between those two things is just a hair's breadth. It is so narrow. As a comic book fan, I am deeply, experienced in this particular contrast. And while I mostly come down on the side of Molly Millions being cool, I am mindful that my verdict on Molly, my judgment of Molly, my response to Molly is informed by my own previous readings of this book and my reading of Johnny Mnemonic 2. I like Molly. I see more in Molly than I think is on the page, but then I know Molly, and I am not sure at this point how good a first impression she makes in the year 2025, right? A year in which we may have many a hot girl Wolverine, including, I suppose, the actual hot girl clone of Wolverine, X-23, right? So we're familiar with this idea of, oh, she's hot, but she's dangerous, but she's hot, but she's dangerous, right? This is not an unfamiliar archetype to us here. And where she falls on the cool to exaggerated and juvenile to the point of silly spectrum, I think is going to vary enormously. And I think that this is more broadly a problem common to speculative fiction, right? In general, I suppose, but particularly common to sci-fi and particularly common to punk subgenres, which predicate at least a little of their narrative and emotional power. Whether we're talking about punk literature or punk comics or punk music, there's something of the power of punk is predicated upon their coolness. And the thing about cool is, as I say, that your mileage may vary. My personal response to Molly is such that if you don't like her here as she shows up, I think we're doing something deliberate, and I think that she will grow on you. I think that she reveals herself to be a more nuanced and capable character. But there's certainly, and also I would not take anything away from Gibson here. There's always that problem, right? The Simpsons did it first. There's always that problem that the originating text in a particular sphere oftentimes gets little credit in the aftermath of its derivatives. We've seen so many versions of Molly, right? Trinity from The Matrix is not a million miles away from Molly Millions. So it's harder to see Molly here in her original form as powerful as she would be in 1982 when she's conceived, when she comes to life, even in the pages, as I say, of Johnny Mnemonic, 81, I guess, for Johnny Mnemonic. So this is the end of the first chapter. We've had a lot of our major world building. That's already done, not in terms of detail, though we have had a lot of detail too, but certainly in terms of tone. We are now familiar with the kind of world Case is living in, the kind of man he is, the kind of desperation that drives the residents, permanent or temporary, of Chiba City. As I say, a lot of that internal tension, a lot of the dynamics that we have observed here, a lot of the relationships that Case has with the people in his life are imported wholesale from pre-existing subgenres, right? They are imported wholesale from noir stories. This is not a Dashiell Hammett novel. This is not a Philip Marlowe story happening here. We're in a very familiar world, so the specifics really pop, and it's in the specifics that we're going to find, well, the bulk of the novel, honestly, as we move forward. I must accelerate here just a little if we're going to finish all of our slides for tonight. This was supposed to be a short reading, but you know how it gets. This carries us into chapter 2 to the Chiba City Hilton, right? We get this immediate kind of contrast and experience from the tiny, cramped coffin hotel room all the way out to the Hilton suite. The introduction of Armitage, the former soldier who was apparently there during the operation called Screaming Fist, when the software used by console cowboys like Case was first used in Siberia. He says that they have profiled Case and discovered both this suicidal inclination and underlying health problems, and then makes him an offer he can't refuse. And I don't really need to pull this because A, I just told you that he makes him an offer he can't refuse, which means that you know exactly how the scene goes anyway. And B, obviously this is the structure of the whole story. If you know going into this that this is a heist movie, then you know that this is a recruitment scene. But I had to pull it just because it is just so fantastic. It's just so well written. Again, this is Gibson, the stylist, giving us the juice here. What would you say if I told you we could correct your neural damage, Case? Armitage suddenly looked to Case as if he were carved from a block of metal, inert, enormously heavy, a statue. He knew now that this was a dream and that soon he'd wake. Armitage wouldn't speak again. Case's dreams always ended in these freeze frames, and now this one was over. What would you say, Case? Case looked out over the bay and shivered. I'd say you were full of shit. Armitage nodded. Then I'd ask what your terms were. doesn't get much better than that, you guys. That is just Tarantino would be happy if he had, I think, written that scene. And again, we get the interplay here of the other side of Case's unbodied self, the other side of Case's mind, right? Kind of, again, emphasizing what Case takes to be dualism, what Case takes to be a very simple conflict between the mind and the body. He wants to be in the Matrix. He wants to be in cyberspace. He wants to be a console cowboy as he used to be, but he is bound here in the flesh. But it is the mind that is turning the screws on that experience. It is the mind and the dreams that he experiences that make that all the harder. We cut ahead there to the clinic the following day where Case questions Molly about Armitage. We get this really effective and disquieting, trigger warnings for body horror through this sequence, especially for me. I don't know why this upsets me so much, but it is awfully visceral and unpleasant. But we get this montage of the procedure of Molly administering this follow-up injection, and then Case waking back up in Cheap Hotel, Molly by his side. He is recovering. We learn that he can't test the procedure for 8 more days, and in the meantime, well, they have sex. "It's okay," she said. "I can see." Sound of the jeans peeling down. She struggled beside him until she could kick them away. She threw a leg across him and he touched her face. Unexpected hardness of the implanted lenses. "Don't," she said. "Fingerprints." Now she straddled him again, took his hand and closed it over her, his thumb along the cleft of her buttocks, his fingers spread across the labia. As she began to lower herself, the images came pulsing back. The faces, fragments of neon arriving and receding. She slipped down around him and his back arched convulsively. She rode him that way, impaling herself, slipping down on him again and again until they both had come, his orgasm flaring blue in a timeless space, a vastness like the Matrix, where the voices were shredded and blown away down hurricane corridors, and her inner thighs were strong and wet against his hips. The clash here, 2 twin clashes, right? In this dark, lightless intimacy that he's sharing with Molly. We've had the beat already of Molly telling him, well, actually, my cool implanted sunglasses also allow me to see in the dark, and they also have a clock in them, which is one of those moments of, oh my God, technology. Can you imagine having a clock in your peripheral vision all the time? How cool is that? The 80s really kind of weighing on us there as we read that. But here, this moment of both a quality of alienness here as he is tracing her face, right? Touching her face during this act of physical intimacy that is about to develop into full-fledged penetrative sex right here in Cheap Hotel. He reaches out to touch her face, a very human thing, and instead encounters the implanted lenses, and not just encounters them. He doesn't just have this intrusion of technology on this moment of intimacy, on the body, the physical being of Molly Millions, but then she wards him off. "Don't," she said, "fingerprints." That it is the technology that can be sullied by the physical flesh of the body, as much as the opposite is true, right? She has had this technology implanted into her, but now if he touches it, he's going to harm it. He's going to damage it. If they engage in this very simple act of intimacy, which is then superseded, of course, by the much greater act of intimacy, which again allows us the juxtaposition of his physical experience in his physical body and this echo, this glimpse of something like cyberspace, something like the Matrix. Again, we get the explicit call out there. His orgasm failing blue in a timeless space, a vastness like the Matrix, where the faces were shredded and blown away down hurricane corridors, and then we collapse back, and her inner thighs were strong and wet against his hips. All of that wonder and the spectacle and the being of the disembodied self drops back suddenly into the meat, into the physical being, which is not an unpleasant place to be, right? There's nothing like consciously nasty or physically repulsive for Case in that moment. Her inner thighs were strong and wet against his hips is just a statement of fact. It's a proof of their intimacy. It's a proof of their mutual pleasure. And yet, in this moment, it is a denial of that thing which he wants most. He is not pursuing her, and we don't know enough about her to say for sure that she is pursuing him. We'll circle back to this because I always have a little trouble reconciling myself to the choices that Molly makes in this sequence and really trying to determine her underlying motivation, but we need to know more about it before we can really call it out. Okay, we have 2 more slides to get to. Even though we are at time, we're going to cover just these last 2 slides and finish up chapter 2 here and the first part of Neuromancer. So we return to Dean trying to get some information on Armitage, which does not work, and my charming. There we go. We've got it. Everything's good. We return to Julius Dean to try and find some information on Armitage, which does not work. And then we have this brief exchange here, including one of my favorite neologistic verb uses that William Gibson has in the entire book. The war. You in the war, Julie? The war? What's there to know? Lasted 3 weeks. Screaming fist. Famous. Don't they teach you history these days? Great bloody post-war political football that was. Watergated all to hell and back. Your brass, Case, your sprawl-side brass in, where was it? McLean? In the bunkers, all of that. Great scandal. Wasted a fair bit of patriotic young flesh in order to test some new technology. They knew about the Russians' defenses. It came out later. Knew about the AMPS, magnetic pulse weapons. Sent those fellows in regardless, just to see. Dean shrugged. Turkey shoot for Ivan? Any of those guys make it out? Christ, Dean said, it's been bloody years. Though I do think a few did. One of the teams got hold of a Sov gunship, helicopter, flew it back to Finland. Didn't have entry codes, of course, and shot hell out of the Finnish defense forces in the process. Special forces types, Dean sniffed. Bloody hell. Watergated, all to hell and back, is so good. The idea of a political scandal of such magnitude that it has now given us an active verb for just a political dogfight is extremely powerful. We conclude this scene, which is really our opportunity to get, yes, a little confirmation on Screaming Fist, a little confirmation on Armitage's description of his own experience here, the connections with the deepest part of the lore, right? We're talking about the invention of the kind of software that is necessary for Case and all the console cowboys to do their job. But really, we're here with Dean to establish that war is good for his business in a genial, immoral kind of way, which sets up the turn that we will get in just a few pages. This is the point in the story at which Case learns that there is a twist in his medical procedure, and we don't introduce, but we highlight for perhaps the first time the theme of addiction in general, right? We've had Linda falling to her addiction. We know that Case is addicted to speed, to methamphetamine, to cocaine, too, by implication. We learn here that he has been rendered biochemically incapable of metabolizing Dex, his preferred brand of amphetamines, and all other kinds of amphetamines, too. His other addiction, the one that he leaned on to get through his severance from cyberspace, has now been taken from him, which is a really interesting kind of contrast. And then the final turn in this, what is effectively our prologue for the story as a whole, kicks off when Molly decides that she wants to go and watch a knife fight. Let's pull up our last slide of the evening. 7 days, and he'd jack in. If he closed his eyes now, he'd see the Matrix. Shadows twisted as the holograms swung through their dance. Then the fear began to knot between his shoulders. A cold trickle of sweat worked its way down and across his ribs. The operation hadn't worked. He was still here, still meat. No Molly waiting, her eyes locked on the circling knives. No Armitage waiting in the Hilton with tickets and a new passport and money. It was all some dream, some pathetic fantasy. Hot tears blurred his vision. Blood sprayed from a jugular in a red gout of light. And now the crowd was screaming, rising, screaming as one figure crumpled, the hologram fading, flickering, raw edge of vomit in his throat. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, opened them, and saw Linda Lee step past him, her gray eyes blind with fear. She wore the same French fatigues. The desperation here for Case, that he is feeling the intrusion again and again, the trauma of this, right? That's really what we're exploring here, is a kind of post-traumatic response. He cannot bring himself to hope in the reality of his circumstance because he has hoped for the reality of his circumstance before now. He came here with the thought that the black market clinics would be able to fix him. He spent all that he had trying to get one test result, trying to find one doctor who would be able to do it. And then even when that failed, even when he turned to the hustler life, when he was just trying to keep his head above water, he was still dreaming. He was still having these memories and these intrusive experiences of the Matrix, of cyberspace. And then, of course, as I say, we see Linda Lee here finally as we're in this moment of panic, this moment of desperation, and this closes out this first run. Case is attacked and the boy is killed by Molly. She uses her flechette weapon, which is terribly, terribly destructive. Case then finds Linda's body also dead, and Molly tells him, though it doesn't seem to hit him fully at this point, that Dean was the one who killed her just because it was cheaper than buying her stolen RAM. Case's stolen RAM, I guess. And then, right at the end of the chapter, we get the turn, the beat. Armitage, Molly, and Case bound a hovercraft to leave Chiba behind and return home to America, to the United States. There's no real... It is unclear whether or not the United States exists. You know what? We'll use the specific term. They're going to return home to the sprawl. And that will carry us into next week's session. I took the trouble earlier today of preparing a slide with the schedule written upon it. And I'm going to tell you right now, as I call that up here live on the stream, that this is going to be a little soft for two reasons. The first is that next Thursday night might not work out. And then the following Thursday night is American Thanksgiving, which also might work out, but also might not. I cannot be more sure or more precise about these dates, I'm afraid, until we get a little closer to them. But right now, the plan is next Thursday night, November 20th, we will look at part 2, the shopping expedition. And the following Thursday, American Thanksgiving, we will look at part 3, Midnight in the Rue Jules Verne. We're going to have 2 sessions after that to look at the climax, the main action of the story. But this should keep us occupied here for a couple of weeks. If you would like to join me here live on a Thursday evening to talk about Neuromancer, then you can do so by heading on over to the Patreon page. That is patreon.com/nextword, where you can pledge your support. You can pledge your support. You don't even have to. You can follow for free. You can head on over there and you can just click the little follow for free button. And then every week you'll get an email from me with the exact link to the live sessions. So if times change, if days change, that's where you'll find all of the information. I will try and be transparent about that as soon as I know more about when those live sessions will take place. I don't anticipate a skip week. I don't anticipate us pushing back any further than we already have. I think we're going to be able to keep to our schedule. It just might be a little more mutable, a little more freeform, a little more jazz. We're going to do just a jazz schedule for the next couple of weeks and see how that works out for us. A jazz schedule as opposed to the Chiba City Blues. That's where we are tonight. That is going to do it for tonight. That's going to do it for our discussion of the first part of Neuromancer. I hope that you have enjoyed the session as much as I have. I can't wait to come back next week and really observe a major pivot in the book. It's such an interesting transition. There is such a forceful transition from one part of this book into the next. And I think that's going to be a real fun discussion. Hugh, thank you so much for joining me live. I hope you had a good time. I will talk to you all again next week. Until then, do please take care. Good night all.